There are people who do, try, strive, give everything they can, and still feel that it isn't enough. Nothing ever seems to close. Each achievement lasts only briefly. Soon another demand appears, another expectation, another point to fix. Life unfolds amid a constant feeling of being in debt to oneself. Billy Graham observed this conflict closely. For him, when everything feels insufficient, the problem is not a lack of effort. It is continuous inner wear. A state in which a person lives in confrontation with themselves, evaluating every step, every decision, as if they were always falling short of who they should be. This feeling does not arise only in moments of failure. It appears even when things go right. The person completes a task, reaches a goal, solves a problem, and instead of relief, feels pressure. Something inside says there is still more missing, more dedication, more results, more proof of worth. What is most confusing is that there is no clear criterion for this demand. There is no defined point where one can stop and say, now it's enough. The standard keeps shifting. What seemed sufficient yesterday no longer is today. Effort renews itself, but satisfaction does not follow. Over time, this feeling becomes part of daily life. The person does not allow themselves to celebrate. They do not recognize their own limits. Everything is seen as a provisional stage, never as a conclusion. Even moments of rest are crossed by performance-driven thoughts. The mind reviews what was done, points out flaws, anticipates the next step. This inner state exhausts in a very specific way. It is not the fatigue of too many tasks, but the fatigue of never arriving at a place of inner acceptance. The person feels as if they are always being tested, always being evaluated, always needing to prove something, even without knowing exactly what. Living this way creates constant tension. Nothing stabilizes inside. The present is experienced as preparation for something that never materializes, and little by little, the person begins to wonder why they feel so drained, even when on the surface, things seem to be going well. Recognizing this sense of insufficiency does not bring an immediate solution, but it brings clarity. It shows that the exhaustion does not come only from what is done, but from the way each effort is received internally. As long as nothing that is done can be considered enough, the conflict remains active, demanding more and more energy to sustain it. When nothing seems sufficient, the conflict stops being occasional and becomes constant. The person is not in disagreement with themselves only at specific moments. They live in that disagreement. Every decision is reviewed. Every choice is questioned. Even when something goes right, doubt arises about whether it was done the right way at the right time, with the right intensity. This conflict is not loud. It does not appear as an open crisis. It manifests as a continuous inner dialogue, demanding and difficult to silence. There is always a but accompanying any progress, a reminder that it could have been better, an adjustment to make, a mistake to avoid next time. Over time, this inner tension becomes familiar. The person no longer clearly perceives how much they pressure themselves because it has become the default mode of functioning. Being at peace with oneself starts to feel strange, almost irresponsible. Inner vigilance is confused with care, and conflict comes to be seen as a necessary engine to keep going. The problem is that living in constant conflict consumes too much energy. There is no real rest, not even when everything is relatively fine. The inner world remains on alert, ready to correct, improve, adjust. The person feels they can never lower their guard because something is always at stake, their own sense of worth. This state also affects relationships with others. Comparisons arise easily. Other people's progress becomes a reference for even more internal pressure. The person measures themselves constantly, even when no one is asking them to. The conflict stops being a response to the world and becomes a permanent internal demand. Thus, the exhaustion does not come only from what is done, but from the continuous confrontation with oneself. There is no pause between one demand and the next. There is no space for neutrality. As long as this conflict remains active, living becomes a constant effort to reach a point of sufficiency that never settles. At some point, the person realizes that effort has stopped bringing real satisfaction. They do more, give more, devote themselves more, and the inner effect is minimal. Recognition fades quickly. The feeling of a job well done barely shows up. Soon another goal appears, another adjustment, another demand that takes the place of what was just completed. Nothing is experienced as enough for long enough. Even important achievements are quickly reduced to mere steps. The person looks at what they reached and, instead of feeling any stability, already sees the next point that needs fixing. The present doesn't hold. It is always interrupted by the pressure of what is still missing. This way of functioning creates a quiet kind of exhaustion. The person starts to wonder why they are still so tired if they are always doing what is expected. The problem isn't the effort itself, but the fact that it never finds a place of inner rest. Everything that is done feels provisional, incomplete, immediately subject to review. Over time, a strange sense of functional emptiness emerges. Life moves forward, results appear, but nothing settles emotionally. Effort does not create belonging nor lasting satisfaction. It only keeps movement going. The person continues because they don't know how to stop, not because they feel fulfilled. Billy Graham observed that when effort loses its ability to bring satisfaction, something important has shifted inside. The work continues, dedication remains, but meaning is drained. Not because of a lack of external purpose, but because the inner world no longer recognizes anything as sufficient. This state does not cause an immediate collapse. It wears a person down gradually. They keep producing, but with the constant sense that something is always slipping away. And the more they try to reach that something through effort, the farther away it seems to become. Billy Graham watched closely people who lived in this continuous conflict with themselves. He saw that it wasn't a lack of ability, nor an absence of commitment. These were people who demanded too much of themselves and rarely allowed themselves to acknowledge their own effort. For him, when someone lives with the feeling that they are never enough, it reveals an exhausted relationship with their own inner life. The person begins to treat themselves like an unfinished project all the time. Each result is evaluated not by what it represents, but by what it still hasn't achieved. The focus is always on the deficit, never on what has already been built. Billy Graham understood that this kind of conflict often forms in environments where being good wasn't enough. You had to be better, where mistakes carried a high cost, where recognition came conditioned on performance, so the person learns to pressure themselves before anyone else does. They learn not to allow themselves a pause, because a pause feels like a sign of settling. That view did not come with condemnation. He did not see these people as failures. He saw them as tired of fighting themselves every day, tired of never reaching a point of inner acceptance. Even when outwardly everything seemed in order, Billy Graham saw how this constant conflict consumes energy quietly. There is no obvious crisis, but there is continuous wear. The person lives on alert, revisiting decisions, evaluating choices, comparing results. The inner world becomes a place of permanent tension. For him, understanding this was essential. Not to fix it quickly, but to change how the person sees themselves. When someone understands that they live in conflict not because of failure, but because of excessive demand, something begins to reorganize, not on the outside, but in the way this conflict is perceived and sustained. Over time, self-pressure stops being a response to specific situations and becomes an inner habit. The person no longer needs external goals to demand more of themselves. Even in neutral moments, the mind evaluates, compares, points out what could have been different. The demand stays active regardless of context. This habit forms gradually. At first, self-criticism seemed useful. It helped improve, avoid complacency, move forward. But without noticing, the pressure stopped being a tool and became the default setting. Everything is filtered through it. No result is received in a simple way. Everything goes through review. The person wakes up already in a state of evaluation. Throughout the day, they monitor their own performance. At the end of it, they mentally revisit what they did, what they said, what they failed to do. There is no real interval between action and judgment. The inner world remains occupied with measuring, adjusting, correcting. Billy Graham understood that this kind of self-pressure does not come from excessive ambition, but from constant insecurity. When someone does not feel sufficient on the inside, they try to compensate with control. They control effort, behavior, results. Pressure becomes an attempt to guarantee worth. The problem is that inner habits are rarely questioned. The person begins to believe that this level of demand is simply part of who they are. They cannot imagine another way of functioning. Resting from self-pressure feels dangerous, as if lowering the level of demand meant losing direction. So the pressure keeps operating even when it is no longer necessary. It keeps the person moving, but it also keeps them in conflict. A conflict that cannot be resolved with more effort, because it is excessive effort itself that sustains it. As long as this habit goes unnoticed, the feeling of insufficiency keeps repeating, even in the face of concrete results. When self-pressure becomes a habit, comparison stops being only with others and starts happening mainly on the inside. The person constantly measures themselves against ideal versions of who they should be. There is always an internal image of how they should be acting, performing, feeling, or responding, and it almost never matches reality. This internal comparison is exhausting because it has no fixed reference point. The ideal changes according to the day, the context, the mood. At times the demand is to be more productive, at others more balanced, sometimes stronger, other times more sensitive. The person tries to meet all these versions at once and inevitably fails. Living this way creates a constant sense of inadequacy. No matter how much is done, there is always a gap between what was done and what should have been done. That gap turns into automatic self-pressure. There is no pause to acknowledge effort. Comparison already begins by pointing out flaws. This inner state also weakens the perception of one's own path. The person loses reference to what truly matters to them because they are always trying to adjust to an unstable internal standard. The focus stops being on living and becomes correcting oneself all the time. Billy Graham perceived that this constant internal comparison did not produce real growth, it produced tension. He understood that when someone lives measuring themselves against an unattainable ideal, they end up living in permanent conflict. There is no possible victory because the criterion is never satisfied, so the person keeps trying to reach themselves but never arrives. The conflict does not come from outside. It is internal, repetitive, exhausting, and as long as this comparison remains active, the feeling of never being enough persists, regardless of what is done. This inner conflict does not form in isolation. It is fed day after day by expectations that come from the outside. There are standards of success, maturity, balance, and performance constantly circulating. Even when they are not stated directly, they are perceived. The person learns what is valued and begins to use it as a ruler to measure themselves. The problem is that these external expectations rarely consider real limits. They highlight results, not processes. They show what was achieved, not the emotional cost of getting there. The person observes, compares, and concludes that they are still not at the right point, that something is missing, that they have not yet arrived. Over time, these external references are internalized. No one needs to demand anymore. The person does it themselves. They use other people's models as parameters and feel constantly below them. Even when they are doing well, there is the impression that they could be doing better, faster, with more control. Billy Graham perceived that many people lived in conflict not because they wanted too much, but because they measured themselves by criteria they had never consciously chosen. He understood that when external expectations are absorbed without filtering, they begin to operate as a permanent inner demand. This process deepens the exhaustion. The person no longer knows whether what they feel comes from within or from outside. They only feel pressure. Pressure to meet expectations, not to disappoint, not to fall behind. And while this pressure remains active, the feeling of insufficiency keeps renewing itself, even when the effort is genuine. In this way, the conflict with oneself is sustained not only by internal demands, but by the weight of external expectations that were never questioned. Life starts to be lived as a constant response to standards that take into account neither who the person is nor how long they have already been trying. Living with the feeling of never being enough produces a kind of wear that does not appear immediately. It accumulates. The person keeps functioning, fulfilling what needs to be done, but inside feels a fatigue that ordinary rest cannot resolve. It is not just physical exhaustion, it is constant emotional wear. This fatigue comes from the daily confrontation with oneself. Every action is followed by evaluation. Every pause comes with guilt. Every result is minimized. There is no moment of inner neutrality. The mind stays active, reviewing, comparing, correcting. Even when nothing is wrong, something inside remains on alert. Over time, this state affects how the person experiences their own life. Small joys lose their strength quickly. Achievements are not absorbed. Everything passes too fast to generate real satisfaction. Life always feels incomplete, as if something is missing that never arrives. Billy Graham understood that this exhaustion was not a sign of weakness, but of excess demand, excess vigilance, excess inner conflict. He perceived that people like this do not allow themselves simply to exist. They are always trying to adjust to a standard that keeps changing. This wear also affects the relationship with the future. The person cannot imagine a moment when they will feel at peace with themselves. Tomorrow already comes loaded with expectations and corrections. The present is never enough to rest. Thus, fatigue becomes part of the day. There is no obvious collapse, but there is continuous depletion. A depletion that cannot be explained only by what is done, but by how much one fights internally to finally feel sufficient, without ever reaching that point. Here the pace slows down, not to explain better, nor to organize everything at once, just to interrupt for a moment the constant conflict that has been described. When someone lives under constant self-pressure, even thinking about it can be tiring. The pause here is not a solution, it is an interval. There are people who have already tried to relax this self-demand and realize they could not. Even in moments of rest, something remains active inside. The mind reviews the day, anticipates the next one, points out what is still missing. Silence does not bring relief. It only opens space for more evaluation. Perhaps it is enough simply to notice this. To notice how the demand does not depend on external circumstances. It continues, even when nothing urgent is happening. To notice how the idea of being sufficient always seems postponed, as if it required more proof, more effort, more time. This pause does not ask for immediate change. It does not ask for a decision. It does not ask for the pressure to disappear. It only asks for recognition. Recognition that living in conflict with oneself requires constant energy, that keeping this state active all the time has a real cost, even when it is not visible. Here it is not necessary to ask how to stop being demanding of yourself, nor when this will get better. It is enough to admit that the pressure has become part of the inner functioning, that it did not arise out of nowhere, that at some point it seemed necessary. This recognition does not resolve the conflict, but it changes how it is lived. The pressure stops being seen only as a virtue and starts to be perceived also as a weight. And this perception creates a small but important space where the conflict can, at least for moments, stop commanding everything. At the core of this constant conflict, there is a persistent fear, the fear of never reaching a place of inner rest. The person fears that even if they do everything right, it still won't be enough. This fear is not always conscious, but it guides choices, pace, and expectations. Billy Graham observed that many people lived as if they were always close to a limit that never materializes, always almost there, always needing one more adjustment, one more effort, one more proof. He understood that this fear was not of failure, but of never finding a place of acceptance. This fear leads the person to keep the conflict active. It is as if lowering the level of demand were too risky. If I stop pushing myself, I might lose my way. I might become complacent. I might stop being who I need to be. The conflict becomes a guarantee of movement. The problem is that this movement does not lead to a place of arrival. It only keeps the person occupied. The fear of never arriving makes them live in a permanent state of correction without ever experiencing real closure. This fear also prevents recognition. Even when something is done well, the person hesitates to accept it. There is always doubt about whether it is enough. And in the face of that doubt, the conflict renews itself. As long as this fear remains active, sufficiency feels unreachable, not because it doesn't exist, but because the criteria to reach it are never defined. And so the person keeps trying to reach a point that keeps shifting, keeping the exhaustion and the conflict alive. At some point, the conflict stops being just an experience and begins to define who the person believes they are. They no longer see themselves as someone who demands too much, but as someone who needs to demand too much. The pressure becomes identity. The conflict becomes part of the way of existing. At that point, imagining a life without self-pressure feels strange, almost irresponsible. If there is no conflict, what keeps everything in order? If there is no constant demand, who guarantees that the person will keep trying? These questions are not clearly articulated, but they guide behavior. Billy Graham perceived that many people sustained this conflict because it gave them a sense of direction. Even though exhausting, it offered a sense of purpose. The person knew what to do: correct, improve, adjust. The problem is that this identity does not allow rest. It does not admit pause. It does not recognize limits. Living this way creates a functional but tense life. Everything moves, but nothing relaxes. The person may even reach goals, but cannot inhabit them internally. The conflict follows every achievement, reminding them that something is still missing. Recognizing that the conflict has become identity does not mean abandoning it immediately. It means realizing how much space it occupies, and realizing that perhaps it was useful at some point, but today it demands too high a price. As long as the conflict defines who the person is, the idea of being sufficient remains distant, not because of a lack of value, but because the internal system itself does not allow that conclusion. After all this, there is no clear ending. The inner conflict does not disappear simply because it has been described. It may remain present, influencing thoughts and decisions. What changes is the way it is understood. Billy Graham often observed these states without haste to correct them. He understood that some human experiences require recognition before any attempt at change. Recognizing that living in constant conflict with oneself is not a sign of failure, but of accumulated wear. This recognition does not resolve everything, but it changes the inner tone. The person stops treating themselves as a problem to be fixed and begins to see themselves as someone who has been carrying too much weight for too long. And that matters. Perhaps sufficiency is not something to achieve, but something to allow. Not now, not all at once. Just in small moments when the pressure eases a little, when the conflict does not have to command every thought. Nothing needs to be decided today. Life does not need to be reorganized right now. It is enough to admit that this conflict exists, that it is exhausting, and that it does not define everything a person is. Sometimes the first step is not to become sufficient, but to stop attacking yourself for feeling like you never are. This small shift already changes the way the conflict is experienced, even if it hasn't disappeared yet. If you feel that you live in constant conflict with yourself, that nothing you do ever seems enough, and that self-pressure never turns off, I suggest you subscribe to the channel, because this space was created to help you understand this inner exhaustion with more clarity and less judgment. Here the reflections follow a calm and direct rhythm, inspired by the way Billy Graham observed people who were tired of fighting themselves. By subscribing, you gain continuity, content that helps reduce inner pressure, understand where self-demand comes from, and create more space to live without this permanent confrontation. And if you'd like, the comments are open as a simple space for expression. Sometimes saying that nothing ever seems enough is already a beginning.